In the stillness of solitude, we often find ourselves confronting a profound truth. We are not afraid of being alone, we are afraid of facing who we truly are. This fear stems from the depths of our unconscious, where aspects of ourselves remain hidden, awaiting acknowledgement. Loneliness, as commonly understood, is the absence of others. However, true loneliness arises from the absence of self-connection. When we are disconnected from our inner selves, no external presence can alleviate the emptiness we feel. Carl Jung's concept of the shadow represents the parts of ourselves that we repress or deny. These aspects, though hidden, influence our behaviors and perceptions. To achieve personal growth, we must confront and integrate these shadow elements, embracing the wholeness of our being. The process of individuation, as Jung describes, is the journey towards self-realization. It involves integrating the unconscious with the conscious mind, leading to a balanced and authentic self. This path requires courage, as it demands facing uncomfortable truths and embracing the entirety of our psyche. Many fear solitude because it brings them face to face with their true selves, their fears, insecurities, and unresolved conflicts. This confrontation can be unsettling, but it is essential for personal transformation. Embracing solitude allows for deep introspection and self-discovery. In the silence, we can confront our true selves and begin the journey toward healing and wholeness. Loneliness is often considered a void, an emptiness imposed upon the self by circumstance or the absence of others. Yet this perception is superficial, for the true nature of solitude is not found in the mere physical separation from human company. It is, rather, a mirror held up to the soul, reflecting the hidden depths that one has long avoided. The modern mind, so accustomed to distraction and external validation, recoils from this encounter with itself. There is an instinctive fear that in the absence of others, one will confront an unfamiliar, perhaps unwelcome, self. But this fear is not truly of being alone. It is the dread of meeting that which has been suppressed or denied. In solitude, the psyche is unmasked. The masks worn in society, those roles that protect the ego and mediate interaction, lose their power. One no longer has the comforting reflection of another to project upon. This is precisely why solitude is so often avoided, even when it is available. The individual who fears being alone is not merely anxious about external isolation, but about the internal revelation that accompanies it. Within this quiet, the shadow, those aspects of oneself that one refuses to acknowledge, begins to stir. These unexamined traits, impulses, and desires, long confined to the unconscious, emerge with a subtle insistence. To face them is to confront one's true nature, and it is this confrontation that terrifies more than the absence of companions ever could. Yet within this terror lies the seed of growth. The illusory fear of loneliness is an invitation to individuate, to reconcile the conscious with the unconscious. In the absence of distraction, the mind is compelled to reflect, to listen to its own whispers. The inner dialogue that arises in solitude is often uncomfortable, for it exposes the contradictions, the fears, and the unfulfilled longings that have been repressed. But it is only through this exposure that the self can achieve wholeness. The illusion of loneliness, therefore, is precisely that, an illusion. It masquerades as emptiness while it is, in truth, the fertile soil in which self-knowledge and transformation take root. To encounter oneself without pretense is a profound act of courage. It requires the willingness to dwell in silence, to endure the discomfort of one's own company without seeking escape. Those who flee from solitude often turn to noise, to social engagement, or to mindless activity in order to avoid the inner confrontation that solitude demands. Yet these diversions, though temporarily comforting, prevent the necessary dialogue with the psyche. The moments that might have been spent in reflection are instead filled with external stimuli, and the individual remains unaware of the richness and sometimes the darkness within. It is also in solitude that creativity and insight are nurtured. When the mind is not preoccupied with the expectations of others, it becomes receptive to its own images, thoughts, and intuitions. These are the voices of the deeper self, speaking in symbols and metaphor, revealing truths that cannot be accessed in the constant company of the outer world. Loneliness, then, is a gateway to a dialogue with the self that is both intimate and transformative. It allows the ego to step aside and witness the movements of the unconscious, granting perspective, understanding, and eventually integration. The fear of being alone is ultimately a fear of oneself. The individual trembles not at the absence of society, but at the presence of the unknown within. To live without distraction, to inhabit one's own inner space fully, is a challenge that demands both patience and courage. But it is in this very space that the self may be encountered, not as a fragmented mask or a social construct, but as a living, breathing totality. Loneliness ceases to be a void when it is recognized as an opportunity, as a crucible in which the hidden aspects of the psyche may emerge, be confronted, and finally be embraced. In this light, what is called loneliness is transformed from a state of deprivation into a state of revelation. It is a mirror reflecting the unacknowledged, the shadow, and the potential for self-realization. To step into solitude, then, is not to suffer absence, but to meet the self in its fullness. The fear dissolves as the individual recognizes that true companionship resides not merely in the presence of others, but in the intimacy with one's own being. And in that intimacy, one discovers a richness of experience and awareness that no external connection could ever provide. Within each of us exists a hidden realm, a part of the psyche that is often unacknowledged, disowned, or denied. This is what one might call the shadow, a repository for all that the conscious self refuses to admit, whether it be impulses, desires, fears, or traits deemed unacceptable. To live without confronting this shadow is to live a life only half seen, for it exerts influence upon our thoughts, emotions, and actions in ways we scarcely recognize. We are unaware of the forces shaping us until they erupt unbidden into our conscious experience, often in forms we cannot easily reconcile with our self-image. The shadow is not inherently evil, though it may contain aspects society labels as such. It is simply the unintegrated portion of the self, a necessary counterpart to the persona, the mask we wear in public to navigate social expectations. While the persona represents order, control, and conformity, the shadow contains chaos, unpredictability, and raw authenticity. Ignoring it may offer temporary comfort, yet it invites repression, leading to inner conflict and projection. What we most despise in others, what provokes disproportionate anger or envy, is often a reflection of the shadow within ourselves. It is the unrecognized mirror of our inner world, showing the qualities we refuse to see in our own behavior. Encountering the shadow is an unsettling experience, for it demands honesty and courage. To gaze upon oneself without illusion is to confront aspects of character that challenge the image we carefully maintain. One may see jealousy, arrogance, cruelty, or weakness, but these qualities are not external intrusions. They are intrinsic elements of the psyche. They exist not to condemn us, but to awaken self-awareness. By acknowledging their presence, one begins the process of transformation, for the shadow holds within it not only our fears, but also untapped potential, creative energy, and authenticity. It is a source of vitality, a hidden reservoir of strength that, when integrated, enriches the whole self. The process of integration is neither simple nor comfortable. It requires a willingness to endure discomfort, to recognize that the self is not solely composed of light or virtue, but is a complex interplay of light and darkness. In this encounter, one may feel shame, guilt, or fear. Yet, these emotions are not signs of failure. They are indicators that one is in contact with the unconscious, traversing terrain that is essential for growth. Avoidance leads only to stagnation, to a life shaped by the projections of the shadow onto others, perpetuating conflict, misunderstanding, and inner fragmentation. To integrate the shadow is to embrace the paradox of the human condition, that we contain both constructive and destructive impulses, both wisdom and folly, both love and aggression. This recognition does not diminish the self, it enlarges it. It allows for authenticity, for a life lived in awareness of one's own complexity. The individual who has not acknowledged the shadow is incomplete, reliant upon external validation, and prone to repetition of unconscious patterns. The one who embraces it gains freedom, a consciousness that can navigate both internal and external worlds with balance and insight. In practical terms, encountering the shadow may appear in dreams, sudden emotional reactions, or recurring patterns of behavior. These are the unconscious making itself known, signaling the parts of the self that have been denied. To ignore them is to perpetuate conflict. To acknowledge them is to begin the delicate work of integration. This is not a moral exercise but a psychological necessity, a means of cultivating wholeness. It is a path that demands honesty, humility, and the courage to face what one has long avoided. Ultimately, the shadow is both a challenge and an invitation. It confronts the individual with truths that are uncomfortable, yet essential, and offers the possibility of profound self-knowledge. To live fully is to recognize the shadow not as an enemy, but as a companion, guiding us toward authenticity and balance. In the dialogue between the conscious self and the shadow, one finds the depth and richness of the human psyche, the integration of opposites, and the path towards self-realization. To deny it is to remain fragmented, to embrace it is to become whole. There exists within each person a journey, a path of discovery that is both subtle and profound, a movement from the fragmented awareness of the ego toward the recognition of the self in its entirety. This journey is what one might describe as the process of individuation. It is not a goal imposed from outside, nor a destination defined by society. It is an inward calling, a recognition that the psyche seeks wholeness and coherence. The individual begins life largely dominated by the ego, shaped by external expectations, cultural norms, and the demands of survival. Yet beneath this surface lies the deeper self, containing both conscious and unconscious elements, yearning to be known, integrated, and expressed. The path of individuation is neither straight nor easy. It requires the courage to face the unconscious, to acknowledge the aspects of oneself that have been neglected, repressed, or denied. In this process, one must confront the shadow, those parts of the psyche that disturb the comfortable image of who we think we are. It is here, in the encounter with our inner darkness, that the seeds of transformation are sown. We may encounter traits we have long judged, desires we have suppressed, fears we have avoided, yet the willingness to acknowledge them is the very act that initiates growth. The psyche moves toward balance not through denial, but through integration of its disparate parts. This process is marked by cycles of confrontation and reflection, often mediated by symbols, dreams, and the subtle language of the unconscious. Dreams, in particular, serve as a bridge between the conscious mind and the deeper layers of the psyche, revealing truths that cannot be accessed through reasoning alone. The images that arise in dreams are not random, they are expressions of the self calling attention to what must be integrated. To ignore them is to resist the self. To attend to them is to walk the path of awareness. Each symbol, each insight, is a guidepost toward greater cohesion and understanding, a step in the gradual unfolding of the whole being. Individuation also involves the reconciliation of opposites within the psyche. The human mind is structured by dualities, light and shadow, masculine and feminine, reason and instinct, life and death. The tension between these opposites produces conflict when they remain unintegrated, yet it is this very tension that drives growth. To recognize and harmonize these forces within oneself is to approach the self in its fullness. It is to acknowledge that no single facet of the psyche can define us entirely. Wholeness arises from the interplay of all parts, from the conscious embrace of the unconscious. This reconciliation does not destroy individuality, it clarifies it, allowing one to act from a place of authenticity rather than mere reflex or habit. The process of individuation is deeply personal and cannot be substituted by the influence or approval of others. External guidance may illuminate the path, but it cannot walk it for the individual. One must cultivate self-reflection, solitude, and the patience to endure periods of uncertainty and discomfort. There are moments of resistance, of confusion, of despair, when the unconscious refuses to yield its secrets easily, yet persistence through these trials strengthens the ego, enabling it to contain the greater self without being overwhelmed. Individuation is not the triumph of the ego over the unconscious, but the establishment of a dialogue in which the ego becomes a conscious partner to the greater intelligence within. As one progresses along this path, the ego gradually loosens its dominance and the self asserts its presence. One gains insight into one's own patterns, motivations, and potentials, seeing life through a lens that is both compassionate and discerning. The individual becomes more capable of embracing both the light and the shadow in oneself and others. The process transforms not only personal awareness but also relationships, creativity, and the capacity to engage with the world in a manner that is neither reactive nor superficial. Ultimately, individuation is the realization that the self is not static or singular, but a living, dynamic totality. It is a movement toward completeness, not through conformity, but through the courageous acknowledgement of all that one is. It demands honesty, patience, and the willingness to encounter the unknown within. In this journey, one finds meaning, purpose, and the profound satisfaction of living in alignment with the deepest currents of the psyche. The process is lifelong, yet each step brings the individual closer to wholeness, revealing that the path itself is both the challenge and the reward, and that to individuate is to become fully, unmistakably oneself. Deep within the human psyche lies a tension that is both inevitable and profound. The tension between the self we present to the world and the self that waits silently in the depths of our unconscious. It is this hidden self that evokes fear, a fear not of circumstance or external challenge, but of facing our own inner reality. Many flee from solitude, from introspection, from the quiet moments in which the mind is unoccupied by distraction, because such moments demand an encounter with what we often refuse to acknowledge. We are not truly afraid of being alone. We are afraid of being confronted by the truths that solitude uncovers. This fear arises from the accumulation of denied impulses, unacknowledged desires, and repressed emotions. The psyche resists the exposure of its hidden facets, for they often conflict with the carefully constructed image of who we believe ourselves to be. We imagine ourselves moral, rational, and capable, yet in the shadows lie anger, jealousy, inadequacy, and longing that we would prefer to ignore. These elements are not separate from us, they are intrinsic to the totality of the self. The encounter with them is frightening precisely because it threatens the coherence of the ego, shaking the foundations upon which our sense of identity has been built. In avoiding this confrontation, the individual risks projecting these disowned elements onto others, perceiving in them the faults and weaknesses that exist within the self. This projection obscures reality, distorts relationships, and perpetuates inner conflict. The things we despise or fear in others are often mirrors of the unrecognized dimensions of our own psyche. To deny them is to remain unconscious, to live in partial blindness, and to surrender agency over the very forces that govern our thoughts and behavior. The fear of self-confrontation, therefore, is both a defense and a limitation, protecting the ego while preventing the emergence of awareness and wholeness. Yet the very confrontation we dread is the path to liberation. It is through the deliberate engagement with the self that one can begin to integrate what has been hidden, to recognize that the shadow, far from being a destructive force, holds the potential for creativity, vitality, and authenticity. The process demands courage, for it entails moving beyond the superficial comfort of the persona and facing the complexity of one's own inner world. In this encounter, the individual discovers that the darkness within is not merely an enemy but a companion, offering insight, depth, and the capacity for profound transformation. This confrontation is often mediated by dreams, introspection, and the spontaneous emergence of thoughts and feelings that cannot be easily dismissed. Dreams speak in symbols, presenting images and scenarios that reveal the unconscious at work, calling attention to unresolved conflicts and hidden aspects of the self. To attend to these messages is to listen to the wisdom of the inner world, to recognize the truths that the ego may resist. It is in this attentive engagement, sustained over time, that fear gradually diminishes, replaced by understanding and integration. The individual learns to hold the contradictions of the self without being overwhelmed, to embrace both light and shadow as necessary and complementary aspects of being. The fear of self-confrontation is, therefore, a threshold. It is the point at which the psyche invites the individual to choose between avoidance and engagement, between stagnation and growth. To cross this threshold requires patience, honesty, and the willingness to endure discomfort. It is not a path of sudden revelation, but of gradual illumination, a slow unraveling of pretense and denial, allowing the self to emerge in its authentic complexity. Each act of recognition, each moment of introspection, diminishes the hold of fear and strengthens the capacity for self-knowledge. Ultimately, to confront oneself is to embrace the full spectrum of existence within. It is to acknowledge that life is not merely a performance of socially acceptable behaviors, but a journey of discovery in which all facets of the psyche have their place. The process is neither linear nor easy, yet it is indispensable for the cultivation of authenticity, wisdom, and psychological balance. By facing the self, one ceases to be a stranger in one's own life and begins to live with integrity, courage, and a deeper connection to the profound currents of being that flow through the human soul. Fear, once acknowledged and engaged, becomes the doorway through which the self attains wholeness and freedom. There is a profound wisdom in the moments when one stands alone, unaccompanied by the noise and expectations of the external world. Solitude, though often feared or avoided, is not a state of deprivation but a fertile ground for the unfolding of the psyche. It is in these quiet spaces that the self, stripped of pretense and social obligation, is free to reveal its hidden dimensions. Those who resist solitude do so not because of its emptiness, but because in its silence they encounter the unexamined currents of their own being. To embrace solitude is to confront oneself honestly, to witness both the light and the shadow within, and to begin the slow work of transformation. The mind, when unoccupied by distraction, turns inward. In this turning, it meets thoughts and feelings that have long been suppressed or ignored. The unconscious, which governs much of our emotional life, begins to speak, revealing patterns, desires, and fears that demand recognition. Solitude is the medium through which this dialogue occurs, for in the presence of others, the ego's defenses are often engaged, suppressing the subtle voices that arise from within. The courage to remain alone, To observe the self without judgment or avoidance is the first step toward growth. It is here that the individual begins to understand the multiplicity of the self, the interplay of conflicting impulses, and the deep well of potential that resides beneath surface consciousness. In solitude, one confronts the shadow not as an enemy to be defeated, but as a part of the self that requires acknowledgement and integration. The qualities we resist or deny, the impulses we reject, and the fears we suppress emerge most vividly in the quiet. To face these aspects of oneself is a demanding task, for it requires the suspension of self, deception, and the willingness to accept complexity without immediate resolution. Yet it is precisely through this confrontation that growth occurs. The shadow, once recognized, ceases to operate solely in the unconscious. It becomes a source of energy, insight, and authenticity, available to the conscious self for constructive expression. Solitude also fosters reflection, the careful examination of one's experiences, decisions, and aspirations. The external world, with its incessant demands, rarely permits such introspection. In solitude, the individual can consider life's events not through the lens of societal expectation or external judgment, but with clarity and depth. Patterns of behavior, recurring emotional responses, and long-held assumptions are revealed, and with this revelation comes the possibility of conscious choice. Growth is not imposed from outside. It arises from this engagement with oneself, a deliberate cultivation of awareness and understanding. Furthermore, solitude nurtures creativity. When the mind is unburdened by distraction, it can explore ideas, images, and connections that are otherwise overlooked. These creative insights often emerge spontaneously, as if the psyche itself is speaking through symbols, intuition, or imaginative thought. To embrace solitude is to open the door to this inner richness, to permit the unconscious to contribute to the conscious life in ways that enhance both personal and collective understanding. Creativity, in this sense, is not merely aesthetic, but a manifestation of a deeper psychological integration, a sign of the self expressing its fullness. The fear of solitude is ultimately a fear of the self. It is easier to seek constant engagement, to fill every moment with activity, than to face the quiet and the unknown within. Yet avoidance reinforces fragmentation, leaving the individual disconnected from inner wisdom and inner strength. By embracing solitude, one accepts the necessity of self-confrontation and self-reflection, recognizing that the path to growth lies not in escape but in engagement. In these moments of stillness, one discovers resilience, clarity, and a deeper alignment with the essential currents of the psyche. To live with solitude is to cultivate the capacity for self-reliance, authenticity, and inner harmony. It is not a retreat from life, but a preparation for it, a space in which the self may be examined, understood, and integrated. The rewards of solitude are not immediate or external, but subtle, profound, and lasting. They manifest in the capacity to act with intention, to respond with wisdom rather than habit, and to navigate life's complexities with insight. In embracing solitude, one engages in a process of growth that is both intimate and expansive, a journey toward wholeness that ultimately transforms the way one exists in the world. As we stand at the threshold of self-awareness, let us not shy away from the solitude that beckons us. For it is in the quiet moments of introspection that we uncover the depths of our being and embark on the path to becoming who we are truly meant to be.